How's it going, guys? So today I'm going to talk about 10 things that I do on almost all of my renders to just give it a little bit more photorealism. Now, before I get into this, I do want to address who this video is for because I've talked about photorealism on the channel before, and people love to get mad at me when I do that because it can be a touchy subject, and there are hundreds of tips and tricks that are very specific to each individual thing. And again, people love to get mad at me because they're very opinionated. If you have been doing Blender in 3D for several years, this video is not for you. I made these specific tips for people who are kind of in their early months and years of doing 3D, and your goal is to just get something out that looks good. Just something that you can fix, some issues, different things like that, that make your render less distracting, and so that the viewer can focus on why your render is good. Again, you're just trying to render out something that looks good, and you're trying to avoid mistakes or things that are so distracting that it's like, golly, that looks super 3D and beginner and da-da-da. That's who this is for. So if you're a professional, if you have a lot of cool tips and tricks, put them in the comments. Be kind. That's who this is for. Let's get into the tips. So the first one is a little hacky, but just don't show everything. The less you show, the less you have to make look better. And I'm going to give you an example here. Here's a picture of just a car. Notice how it's not lit in every piece. Not everything has a light on it. There's a lot of negative space. There's a lot of shadow, and it's showing off the shape of the car and how nice it is. You have a simple paint material, it's just a nice car. And so if you are working on a modeling tutorial or working on your own model, you don't have to focus on the environment around it. Just light the things that are important. Don't show everything. I'm going to show you a contrasting example here. This car, they added an environment around it, HDRI, a floor, and all that. And what that does is it kind of takes you out of how good this model is, because it is a really good model, but the environment around it makes it look very CG-esque. And the first render with the black and white car just looks better, looks cleaner, looks sharper, looks more professional. That's what you kind of want to go for if you're just trying to focus on making it look a little less 3D looking and more closer to, oh, maybe this is a real image. Maybe this is just something that looks more real, less fake, or, one step toward photorealism. Now, I get caught in this all the time, is getting lost in the world of procedural materials. If your goal is photorealism, you're going to want to use image textures. Now, if you don't like tiling, of course, you're going to have to do procedural materials. That's why I made the real-time materials pack. Did want to plug that really quick. But image textures are the one-stop shop for just a little bit more photorealism because they're literally photos of real things. And they give you a lot of things there. So use image textures when you really want to. Of course, procedural materials do allow that flexibility and allow all that fun stuff. I use them constantly. I rarely use image textures, but I'm not always going for photorealism. And I've gotten to the point in my art where I know how to kind of make everything look pretty good with what I'm working with. And that skill is going to come with time. The more you learn, the more you work, the more a lot of these tips and tricks are just going to become muscle memory. One super easy thing to do when it is appropriate is depth of field. Now be careful not to add too much depth of field, then it looks like it's a microscopic render, with like a really long range lens, but use some depth of field. Two things that really help with photorealism is either mimicking your render to the way your eyes see things or mimicking a render to the way a camera sees things. Now, your eyes do have depth of field. If you put your hand in front, you have that depth of field, so you do kind of have that crossover. But what I would do is look at photos of things where the subject is similar to the subject that you are rendering and see how much depth of field is there and try to mimic that. Again, don't do too much. So I'm going to show you, here's the render I was using to demonstrate the image textures. Here it is without depth of field. Here it is with depth of field. It just makes it a little bit better. It makes it just a little bit more believable. Again, the goal here is just get one step closer to something that looks a little more real and less CG beginner looking. Now this is a fun one. This one's more focused on having control after you hit the render button. And it's render at filmic log with your color space. It's going to make everything go from contrasted to super flat, and make sure you are rendering it at 16-bit if you choose to do this. I'm looking for control. The reason I do this is I don't want to have to worry about every single thing in my viewport because things have to render in the viewport. So if I can focus on color in post, and I do it in Photoshop, so I can focus on how does it look in the real world, and I can use references while I'm color grading doing that in Photoshop. And on that note, do not do everything in Blender. It's just not realistic, and almost no professionals do that. I'm going to show you an image here. This is my Max Hay. This is a before and after. It looks so much better with the after, and it looks awesome, and it just looks one step closer to that photorealism, one clip closer to that beautiful realism. He's doing all that in Photoshop. I believe it's in Photoshop, and he does an amazing job. Do not focus on getting everything perfect in the viewport. Do what you can in the viewport, render it out. You have more control, and you have the ability to change things, and everything doesn't have to render out. All that stuff allows more flexibility, allows more control, and you can really focus on getting a step closer to some photorealism. Now, I mentioned making things behave like a camera, and this one is perfect for that. If you've ever been a photographer and you go outside and you're taking photos in broad daylight, the sun is like right above, you are bringing your exposure, you're bringing your ISO down, making that bright go to dark. So if you've ever used the sky texture in the Blender world settings, you know as soon as you put it in there, it's way too bright, and they do that on purpose because they want you to go to your color settings and bring that exposure down. It will make a noticeably better effect, and it just looks real, and that is how a camera works anyway. You just bring that exposure down. It's going to make it look better. It's going to make it look cleaner, more believable, and I honestly love the way it looks. Even when I'm using area lights, sometimes I bring them way too bright, bring my exposure down. It allows a little bit more control, and it's just a little bit better, more believable, and a step closer to photorealism. If I had $1 for every time I said a step closer to photorealism, I'd be rich, but that's the whole theme. Leave some noise. Again, this is about cameras. Your eyes don't really have noise, but your camera does have noise if you're shooting with a camera in low light conditions. I hate denoising. I almost never do it. But what I do love to do is leave some noise in my renders. It's just realistic. If you've been a photographer, you know the struggle of noise. Leave a little bit of noise in your render when there is some. You don't want to force it in, but if there's already some in there, don't take it all out. Don't try to make all your samples so high that there's no noise. That's unrealistic. Again, it's going to make it look a little bit more real, a little more gritty, a little bit more natural. Now, in my opinion, the easiest home run for getting closer to photorealism is motion blur. It's quite literally one click. Just click it. Here's one of my renders without motion blur. Here's one with. It looks better, it looks more believable, also communicates a little bit of motion, but that's not about photorealism. But if something's moving and you're filming it at 24 frames a second, I mean, even your eyes have motion blur. Add some motion blur, it's gonna make it look a little bit more believable. Now, this one is a pretty common beginner mistake, is adding too much glow with your lights. Now, if you look around and you look at maybe regular lights, and my cat's coming into the camera, I don't know if you can see her. But if you are looking at real images, or the lights around you, they don't always glow. Really, the lights that are glowing are flashlights, car headlights, even your phone light. All of those have glow because they're extremely bright. So if you're going to have glow in your renders, make sure it has some kind of contextual relevance. It needs to have a reason for that. I see a lot of beginners just throwing in the glare node because it looks cool, it looks stylistic, but it kind of pulls you out of it. So be careful with your glare. Definitely add it when you can because it does also enforce realism, but it also can take it back. So just like depth of field, it's about a balance and about finding what's actually realistic rather than just it's simply existing. Volumetrics is one of the easiest things to do as a beginner to kind of hide your mistakes. In large scale, like sci-fi scenes, I used to always add volumetrics, hide maybe bad modeling, hide bad shading, because if you add light, volume, it looks real. But let me show you an example of a really effective way to use volumetrics. So this is a really cool picture of a car. I'm linking all my references below. I did not make this image, but I'm linking some of these references below in case you want to see them. This one, it's on ArtStation, really cool render. But check this out. Here it is without a little bit of volumetrics. Here it is with a little bit of volumetrics. It's probably done in post, but I don't really know how he made it. Notice the difference. Now, both of them look amazing, but what the volume does is it hides a little bit of that kind of ultra sharpness of the 3D render and makes it look a little bit more real. Maybe there was a dust on the camera, maybe there was actually some fog outside, but regardless, it looks better. And that volumetrics really pushed it a little bit forward to more of just a beautiful render rather than like maybe a distracting, overly sharp design. Regardless, this is a beautiful image, and I'm not saying anything bad about it. Now for the last tip, I'm going to read a comment I got on a recent video. I just think this is really great. One thing I've read online and started noticing is that in real life, really hard contrast and highly saturated colors are very rare. Nothing will ever be 100% black or 100% pure red, and the textures used/coloring done on the final render should reflect that. That's absolutely true. When I'm making a lot of my procedural materials, you're adding that color in. Don't bring that little circle thing to the top. Bring it down a little bit because, again, really the only full saturated colors you're seeing is on like TV screens because you're having just bright light. Other than that, just bring it down a little bit. It will help with that just photorealism and not make it look super bright. Over contrast, over saturation just aren't real. So those are my big ticket item, big tips. And I want to give a couple smaller tips. So 2 things that I think are really going to pull people out of your render and just make it look a little less believable is animals, people, and vegetation. So animals and people are one of them. It is extremely hard to make animals and people look real. Unless it's like a silhouette, if you have a person standing in your render, like a really cool environment, sometimes it can be distracting. Sometimes it can make it look very amateur, especially, and also animals. So if you're going to be using people or animal textures, you're going to want to get the best you can find. Otherwise, it's going to kind of pull you out of the render. So be very sparing with how you use those. And also vegetation and trees, this is a little bit easier to make look good. So if you're putting in models, make sure they're good. Make sure they look believable and realistic. Now, 3 things I think are home run hitters for realism and just believability. One of them is metallic materials. They're so easy to make look nice and believable because Blender, especially with cycles, they just handle those reflections really well. So using metallic materials is just a very easy way to make something look less distracting, like, oh, that looks super fake. Also, water. We have things like a noise texture adding to a bump on a material, or even the wave modifier. Those are home runs. They're extremely easy to just make look good almost by default. So if you have an opportunity to use them to make it a render, just put it out, make it look good, add those. And the last one, this one almost goes without saying, but if you have a sky in your scene, use an HDRI. It's quite literally an image. Use HDRI skies. Don't make your own sky. Don't try to hide the sky. Keep it in there. It's going to make it look good. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching. I hope you got something out of these tips. Again, if you have your own tips, please put them in the comments. Be nice. Help people out. I'd love to see your own comments. I'll be pinning to the top. One of my favorites. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.